Hello there, this is Taylor Ray and
Ryan Reeh.
And we're here driving from Chicago to St. Louis to hang out with some friends for this weekend. But we're still going to record a podcast this week. Ryan has finally returned from vacation. I just want to say thanks again to our special guest right here at the top, Alex Morenyi, talking about his No Man's Sky impressions, and also Matt Ward, all about Dota 2 and the International. So special thanks again for those two helping me hold down the fort while Ryan was out on vacation in Japan.
Yes, thank you. Not only am I a podcast host, I'm also a listener. And I thought those were very interesting episodes. Thank you so much to you guys. Really appreciate you guys stepping in for me.
So, Ryan, tell us all about your Japanese saga. What'd you do there?
So I was there with my fiance. We basically honeymooned for 2 weeks in Japan.
Honeymoon before you got married.
Right. I know that's kind of a little bit funny. Most people do it the other way around. But yeah, I had been to Japan before, and my fiance had not. And I really wanted to go back. Japan is the place where basically video games were born. Being a huge gamer, I really wanted to go back and see some of the same stuff that I had. Maybe go on a little bit of a rare video game treasure hunt. And it had a ton of fun. Saw some video games, played some video games. It was a super fun trip.
So talk to me about this rare video game hunt. Where specifically did you go?
So we went to Osaka and Tokyo. And there's a chain of there's a retro video game shop. It's a chain store called Super Potato, and they sell everything from the family computer. That's what was known as the NES here in the States, but in Japan it was known as a family computer. Everything dating back from then to everything in between. They sell modern game stuff, a lot of Super Famicom, the SNES, Neo Geo games, N64, just a huge bevy of stuff, and I managed to pick up a few games for myself. I picked up a copy of Tetris Battle Gaiden, which is a version of Tetris that came out on Super Famicom. Works a little bit differently than normal Tetris.
Which actually didn't come out here in North America at all, ever.
Right. The closest thing that I would say is it's probably closest to Tetris Attack, which did come out here in the States. It's kind of, if you can imagine, it's like a Tetris game, but in this one, you have magical powers, you play as different characters, and you kind of go head-to-head. In what we've kind of understood Tetris now, in versus modes, you play Tetris, you try to throw garbage on the other opposing player's field, and in this one, there are different characters' powers, basically to mess them up really badly.
What else did you get to see around there? What did you notice while traveling around? Did you happen to see any video games specifically marketed for the Japanese market?
Absolutely, yeah. Japanese people really commute quite a bit. They don't really have time for home consoles, is my sense of things. Very heavily promoted. You could see train station ads, bus ads on TV, a lot of ads for mobile games. One of the Square Enix, of course, Japanese company, heavily promoted a lot of their mobile games. This one that's not available here in the West called Grand Blue Fantasy. It's a tactical strategy RPG game. Looks like very neat character art, very concept art. I wish they would bring it over to the States, but they're heavily promoting that game. Several other games I saw being played on phones. Lots of like Monster Strike, Puzzle and Dragons, games that kind of are free to play, but kind of have these like gacha style mechanics. Gacha, for those who don't know, basically capsule toys. Kind of randomized loot. That's basically what led to a lot of the free-to-play mechanics that we see in these styles of games. But anyway, those were very, very popular. Even people who play games on the 3DS, people who hold traditional handheld consoles, basically playing those kinds of games. I did a lot of street passing.
Was this while on public transportation, like on the subway, or just like walking around the streets?
This is walking around. This is public transportation. Yeah, just a lot of people playing mobile and handheld games. I saw a lot of phones and a lot of 3DSs being played, but I did not see pretty much any Sony products. I was expecting to see more Vitas than I actually did. I didn't see any Vitas out in the wild, but I did see actually 2 separate times people playing PSPs, which the PSP is not a current gen handheld console. That's the last generation Sony handheld. So just based on that anecdotal evidence, I'm not surprised that Sony hasn't really supported the Vita because nobody in Japan owns one, I think.
I mean, if you look here at all the ports that Sony has been doing, and they're all specifically like Japanese games being put out on the Vita. They're not making any either first-party or third-party North American titles. It's all literally Japanese ports. I'm shocked that there aren't more Vita players that are out and about and are super obvious, I guess. I guess Nintendo has such a strong hold on the whole handheld market, and everyone's on their smartphones regardless, that might be the reason why the Vita isn't even selling well out in Japan. I mean, obviously, you're just walking around, you're a tourist, and you're just giving me anecdotal evidence. It's very possible that the Vita might be a lot more popular, but I'm very confident in saying that the 3DS and smartphone markets are much, much, much stronger in Japan.
Absolutely. And the other thing I would say is that Pokemon is huge in Japan. I have never seen so many people wearing Pokemon shirts, people wearing Pokemon merchandise. Of course, a lot of stores actually being run by the Pokemon Company and Nintendo. It's funny, Pokemon Go, which only recently came out in Japan, maybe about 2 weeks before I actually went to Japan. Every woman, man, and child with a smartphone was playing this game. There was actually a big public park in Tokyo that we were walking around in, and there was some app that showed people where Pokemon were, and people were like practically trampling over each other trying to catch Pokemon. It was crazy. Pokemon Go is super popular. I couldn't believe it. The phenomenon that was here, I feel like, has kind of died off a little bit, but in Japan, it's still going very strong. Pokemon, super popular. And I also have to say that, and we'll transition to our next topic here. I saw some numbers about what the top-selling PS4 games were in Japan, and this will probably also speak to my point about gaming not being such a big deal that it once was. So the top three games that have been sold in Japan on PS4, the first one is Metal Gear Solid 5. Not a big surprise. Japanese game made by a Japanese company. Number two, any guesses, Taylor?
I'm trying to think of one. I would probably say Dark Souls or maybe Bloodborne.
So Dark Souls is, I think, like number 9 or something.
Dark Souls 3, just to clarify.
Right. Actually, number 2 is Knack, the PS4 launch.
Oh, the launch title, yeah.
Right. And number 3, and I kid you not, this is Call of Duty Black Ops 3, were the top 3 best-selling games in Japan. And the number 1, Metal Gear Solid 5, huge critical success, let's say, for Konami. In Japan, Metal Gear Solid 5, number 1 best-selling game on PS4, only sold about 460-something odd copies. That's not a lot. That's
460? That's it?
That's it. And, console gaming isn't really the big deal that it once was. It feels like even if you walk into the arcades, which are mostly run by companies like Sega and Taito, you see games like the new Dissidia Final Fantasy, which I played. You see games like Project Diva, which is a rhythm game. You see a lot of crane games, but it's funny. Those are really the only places that people play games. Besides that, and their phones
and pachinko parlors. If you can even count those as true video games.
Well, and it's funny because there are some video game characters appear in pachinko machines. Right, there was that big story that Konami was turning away from their video game business, and they're going to make a Metal Gear pachinko machine. And then we'll actually get into that later with another Metal Gear-related announcement. But
also Castlevania leveraging another one of their licenses as well.
Right. I actually saw a big ad for a Devil May Cry pachinko machine, which is already actively being played. It's just weird to see this crossover between Japanese gaming companies trying to get into gambling because the home console market in Japan is, if it's still there, it's basically non-existent. It's really, really crazy.
I can't imagine those sales. 460 seems even small, even for the size of the country Japan, but it must not include digital sales at all, which I'm sure is a much bigger deal in Japan. I think it might be physical media sales. Is that right?
I'm not sure. We'll link the article from Kotaku in the show notes where I read this, but I just thought that was really crazy. But it really synced up with what I anecdotally saw on my trip. Just not a lot of people. I didn't see a lot of PS4s in a while. I didn't see people buying. The Xbox One might as well not exist. Just a lot of Sony and Nintendo stuff, and not a lot of Sony stuff going out the door. A lot more people interested in playing games on their phone or on the 3DS.
Talk to me a little bit about what video games you played there. You mentioned Final Fantasy Dissidia, right? You played the arcade version of that, which has been out in Japan for a little bit, and I believe is also being ported over here to North America. But what else did you play there?
Of course, going to Tokyo, you have to go to Akihabara if you're a gamer. It's kind of the like electric town. If you're interested in electronics or video games, like absolutely the place to go.
A lot of stores there that just sell a ton of electronics. Anything you can think of that's made in Japan, it's sold there.
Yeah, you see lots of games that are along the same themes. You see, there's a Pokemon game that's actually kind of like Pokemon Stadium, very popular with the kids. You see a lot of games that are based on card games. Nothing like Yu-Gi-Oh, but games where you would bring your own cards. You kind of set it down like there was a Dragon Ball Z card game that I saw there. There was a sequel to Virtual On that I don't think I've ever seen before in the arcades. It looks super neat.
It's like a mech battle arena game for those who are not familiar with Virtual On, one of Sega's very, very early successes in the arcade space.
Right, and we don't really see a lot of games with those kinds of themes with mechs. It's kind of a more niche thing. Armored Core was a big deal for a while, and then its developer From Software started making Dark Souls games, and you know the rest of the story with the Dark Souls games. They stopped making Armored Core games. But yeah, and then surprisingly what I saw, I know it's hot right now, but I did not see any Street Fighter V. I actually saw a lot of Tekken 7, which is still being localized here for the West, but that was a big arcade game. A lot of the arcades that I walked into, fighting games were a huge deal, which is really interesting to me because I feel like that's totally the opposite case here in the United States. Fighting games are still a big deal, but not to the extent that I saw. Like it still had the hype going on, people watching each other play.
Right, big crowds surrounding a lot of the cabinets in the arcades, whereas opposed to here in the U.S., arcades will have maybe one or two fighting game cabinets, period, and if there's a crowd, maybe.
Yeah, it's funny because I don't think Tekken, as far as big video game, fighting game franchises, Tekken is not something I think of. But I guess in Japan, Tekken is way bigger than Street Fighter, or at least that's what I saw. I didn't see Virtua Fighter. There were a few game cabinets that had a lot of the anime fighting games, like Persona 4 Arena, Skullgirls, some BlazBlue, Nitro Plus Blasters, KOF. A lot of those kinds of games. But yeah, fighting games are really popular in Japanese arcades. And so I get why there's a super big focus, and there are a lot of what's left basically of the Japanese video game industry. They're all making fighting games.
Akihabara is home to one of the most famous arcades of all time in the Sega arcade, right? And talk to me a little bit about what the Sega arcade was like.
Right, so the Sega arcade is a few different floors. Each floor has a different set of games. The first two floors are actually all full of Crane games. But what's funny is that the actual prizes for the Crane games are merchandise from other game companies, not just Sega. You didn't see just a bunch of Sonic dolls. It was like Moogles from Final Fantasy XIV. It was anime characters. It was Pokemon dolls. It was really surprising to see. In our perception here in the United States is that all these game companies are it's like the console wars, right?
They're all rivals.
Right, and it seems to be that there's more of a spirit of cooperation, and that actually carries through the other floors if you actually go in Club Sega and you see that. I mean, you'll see driving games like Cruisin' USA, for example, right next to games like the Taito Drum Master, or right next to the Project Diva F. Sega games being paired right next to a Pokemon machine, and it's funny. It's weird seeing that because your perception as an American is just these companies are competing for the same video game audiences, and that's totally not the case in Japan.
At Club Sega, you're talking about those Crane games. In Japan, they actually call them UFO machines, right?
UFO catchers. That's correct.
UFO catchers. That's right. Did you see that article? I think it was on Kotaku. I'll link it in the show notes. But they actually mentioned that there was this hidden Morse code that actually spelled out UFO catchers aren't vending machines. I guess it's sort of like a hidden message to for Sega to say there's no guaranteed win with these machines. Even though you're pumping money into these, you're not necessarily going to get a guaranteed win. I just thought that was a sort of neat little Easter egg they had in the real world.
And I did see those bags. It's funny because vending machines outnumber, especially in Tokyo, kind of outnumber Japanese people. There's about like in a square block, you might see like 30 vending machines. It's pretty crazy. So I get why they would put that machine out there, because the crane game is expensive. It costs about $1 each time you try to play and win a prize at a crane game. Now, of course, the prizes are bigger. They're not just teddy bears like they are here in the States, but it's expensive, and people are super interested in the prizes. And even if you try to knock off a prize at the UFO catcher and you don't quite get it, and you walk away for a minute, you go to the change machine or whatever, sometimes the staff will reset the prizes back in the default position, and it's a really sneaky way. It kind of feels like a carnival trick, like you're not trying to win. And sometimes the staff will try to make it easier and help. So it's completely random, and they put those on the first and second floors to try to entice people into the kind of more hardcore arcade machines, like the fighting games.
Was Club Sega really, really crowded at all times?
On some of the floors were kind of empty. I would say the busiest floor was kind of in the basement, where all basically the kids' games were. A lot of families, a lot of kids playing these cards games that I was describing earlier.
What about DDR?
I did not see any DDR machines.
I am shocked that Dance Dance Revolution is still not a thing in Japan. No, I'm kidding. Of course, it's been a huge thing for a long time.
Yeah,
but
I imagine it was probably a bigger deal when it was a bigger deal here in this country.
Like in the 2000s, probably, yeah.
Right, yeah. My sense of that is that Japanese people are probably just coming to the arcade probably on a lunch break or coming home from work, and most of them actually were for example, the Project Diva machines. That's a rhythm game, and they actually have a headphone jack in the arcade machine. And most people are either interested in listening to their own music or interested in listening to the arcade machine themselves. They're not really interested in talking to other people. They're very interested in just blowing some steam off for maybe 15, 30 minutes and then picking up and leaving.
All right. Anything else you want to add? Oh, let me ask you this before we move on. What other sort of video game merch did you buy there besides the games over at Super Potato?
So there were a lot of Kirby items. Kirby is also super big. I suspect because of that Kirby Planet Robobo game that just came out on 3DS. Heavy promotion of Kirby. Capcom is also trying to put out some merchandise based around Phoenix Wright. So I did see some Phoenix Wright merchandise. They're also trying to push Street Fighter V. I don't think that was super successful, but I did see a lot of Street Fighter.
I was asking, did you buy that stuff?
Oh, yeah. I bought an item from Pokemon Store. I bought you a little Kirby figurine because I thought that was super cute and you might appreciate that. I was very tempted to buy some Mega Man related materials, just some stuff that you wouldn't see here in the States. At the Pokemon stores where they sell a lot of Pokemon merchandise, they sell things that you wouldn't see here, like merchandise for real deep cut Pokemon that aren't first generation very well known here in this country. It's Ursaring, or merchandise based on the newer Eevee evolutions like Leafeon. Who in this country can even name all of the Eevee evolutions? I know you and I can, and I'm not going to test you right now. But I'm just saying that there's some really if you're interested in video game merchandise, some really deep cuts. I did see some the RPG series from Namco, the Tales of. I did see a lot of Tales of Vesperia merchandise. It was just really interesting to see what is actually being worn by people and what people are actually interested in buying. I saw some Metal Gear figurines. I saw a Solid Snake statue. It's all over the place.
One of the things that's also really, really popular in Japan, speaking about vending machines, those capsule machines, what are they called?
Yeah, Gachapon.
Gachapon. And a lot of those Gachapon machines carry exclusive video game characters, like Street Fighter characters, a lot of Nintendo characters, keychains, cell phone charms, stuff like that. Did you try your hand in any of those?
I did. I actually I tried two of them. The one Street Fighter machine I actually got. What I was looking for, the figurine I was looking for, it's Ryu kind of looking like he's being pushed against the side of a piece of glass, and he's meant to be a little figurine, but also a cell phone holder. And I thought that was pretty funny. There was also actually another one in that I might have gone for. It was Guile being squished, and you're supposed to be like a coaster. I also tried my hand at a Kirby machine. I got you a Kirby figurine that also kind of was also supposed to be like a cell phone holder. But yeah, I got myself a Bulbasaur cell phone charm that I'm using as a keychain. Yeah, a lot of that kind of like cutesy niche kind of stuff.
I wish they were more popular here. I know they're random. They're like gumball machines, right? You put in some coins and out spits out a randomized capsule. You're not necessarily going to get what you wanted, but they're still kind of fun. What did you play over there? You brought your 3DS, right? What did you play while you were on the trip?
I did bring my 3DS, and I actually brought Monster Hunter Generations. I recently wrote a review for that on our site, where you can check that out, 1p2p.com. And yeah, I brought that game because I would expect it to actually see fellow Monster Hunters and play with them. I didn't actually see that. Like I said earlier, I did a lot of street passing, and what I saw, what people were playing, because it shows you what the last game they played, I saw people were playing like a wide variety of games. Usually when you street pass in the US, you see like the same 3 games, usually the most recent release from Nintendo, or like Super Smash Brothers, something that's super popular. What I saw in Japan was like people playing the new Yokai Watch game, which isn't even out in the US. I saw people playing old Ace Attorney games. I saw people playing the re-release of Pokemon Yellow. I saw people playing games that aren't even out. There's like a game that was kind of like a feudal Japan history game. Just like a wide variety. It was weird and kind of exciting. I saw people playing the Fire Emblem Fates, just across the board, all different kinds of genres. It wasn't just the same like 2 or 3 games that you see here in America, and I think that's super interesting. I think that what that tells me is that people in Japan are super interested in playing games from all different kinds of genres. It's not just fighting games. It's not just racing games. It's not just rhythm games. It's all over the place. People in Japan do like video games, just maybe not as much as they once did.
Good to know. Thanks for that insight. Let's move on to our top stories from this past week, so we'll catch you up, Ryan. I know you had quite a bit of internet access while you were in Japan, so you're still able to get caught up. First, we have a bunch of Sony news about PS4, mostly about the new PS4 Slim, which a bunch of photos were leaked online. I believe it was first captured by someone on trying to sell their early console on eBay, and then a bunch of sites picked it up. Kotaku, actually Eurogamer did confirm that it was a real unit, but Sony has yet to make a statement on that. They are, however, on first week in September, I believe it's September 7th, organizing a media event where they're likely to announce more details about the new PS4 Slim and also the new rumored PS4K Neo. It's codenamed Neo. But for now, since this is an audio podcast, and if you haven't seen the photos yet online, the new PS4 Slim is shorter, and it sort of looks like you took the existing PS4, which I would describe as more of an angled eraser shape. If you were to put it in a like a panini press, that's what would a PS4 Slim is. Do you think that's an apt description?
Yeah, it kind of looks like it
looks smushed, doesn't it?
Yeah, it looks smushed. It looks softer. It kind of looks like what would happen,
more rounded edges. Yeah.
What would happen if you maybe took like a blowtorch to the ends of like the regular PS4 and made it kind of round and soft? From the pictures, it kind of it's pretty obvious that they're trying to use like cheaper components. I heard a rumor that they're basically trying to slow down production of the original PS4. There are some places in Japan where actually they are sold out of quantities of the original PS4. So this is them trying to drive a new product. Sony's no stranger to console revisions. They did this with the PS3 several times.
PS2 as well.
PS2 as well. Usually their console revisions tend to be pretty good. I think this is probably for them to compete more with Xbox. Microsoft recently put out the Xbox One S. That seems to be a pretty popular console revision from what I understand. And Sony is trying to capitalize on this with the Slim. We didn't hear news about this. We only expected that there was going to be one console revision, the Neo. And I'm just surprised to see them go for a Slim option, much like Microsoft is with the One S and then also the rumored Project Scorpio.
Well, it's no longer rumored. They confirmed it at E3, but we don't know any details about it yet. We don't know the specific internals about what it is yet, or the Neo.
Right, but last generation, when you saw like PS3 and Xbox 360 revisions, not only did we get smaller consoles, we had different options as far as memory space. We had, generally the smaller, thinner consoles were also better consoles. They had consoles with, faster disk drives. They were better connected to the internet. They were more wireless. With what we've seen so far with the details on this PS4 Slim, the only real improvement besides it's smaller seems to be that we're actually going to have tactile buttons for reset and eject the disc. They've gotten rid of the IR sensor. You don't really use that a whole lot on the PS4. And on top of it, there's a small controller revision, a slightly better DualShock 4, but it's also coming with the light bar is now going to be able to be seen through the touchpad, which I don't know about you, but I don't think that's an improvement.
No, I think it's kind of weird that they're doing that, adding a new LED there on the controller instead of on the console itself. I think maybe people thought the LED that was on the front of the PS4, the existing PS4 model, it was just too bright, and also because it wasn't, a tactile button, it was, you could often mistakenly hit the eject button, hit the power button if you were inserting a disc or brushing against the console, and that was sort of obnoxious, and instead moving that to the new DualShock 4 might be a better improvement, but I don't know, it's a little weird. Another new change, then this one is confirmed, Sony actually did announce this, is that there's a new DualShock dongle you can buy, a USB dongle, so you can use PS4 controllers on PC. So, again, trying to compete with Microsoft, but Microsoft is already one step ahead. With the Xbox One S, they revised their controller as well to add Bluetooth in there. So if you do have a Bluetooth adapter in your PC, you don't require an additional dongle to connect your Xbox One controller to PC. So again, a big improvement, and so far Sony does not have that capability. You have to purchase this brand new DualShock dongle in order to use a PS4 controller officially on your PC. There are other third-party ways in order to do that, but just nothing official so far. Some other news coming out of PlayStation. PS Plus is getting a price hike, so if you continue to enjoy the PS Plus free games every month and also like to play a lot of online multiplayer, just know that the price increase has gone up. If you're an existing customer, you actually have already received an email about it. The price hike is now $60 per year, where it used to be $50, so it's a $10 increase, and justifiably so. A lot of people are upset about it because it doesn't seem like Sony is adding anything new. They're not doing any sort of value-added moves by increasing the price. Very weird. Just know that, as I always recommend, you should always wait for an online sale, because a lot of these cards go on sale. PS Plus, either 3-month or yearly cards go on sale around Black Friday. You never really should pay the full retail price now, $60. I would say ballpark it. If it gets down to like 40 or even under to 35, 30 is best. That's the cheapest I've ever seen it. I would highly recommend buying and stocking up and on your membership.
I would also say that I think it's a little bit disappointing that they're doing this price hike and they're not giving us anything new. I think PSN for what it is okay, but download speeds on PSN are atrocious. If you play games on Steam, if you play games on Xbox One, those download speeds generally are pretty decent, like pretty good. And
even patches, I find, even patches on PSN are terribly, terribly slow. And it's not a problem with people's local internet connections. It's with PlayStation servers.
Right. If I get a patch for a game, sometimes patches take like 2 or 3 hours. That's honestly something that prevents me from, or discourages me actually from buying games digitally on their service, because it just takes so long. If you digitally pre-order a game, they often give you the option of preloading, but I never want to do that because it's going to tie up my PS4 for a long time, and it's frustrating that we're this far into an online network for video games, and the file sizes for games have gotten bigger. Games like No Man's Sky have these 10 gigabyte day one patches, and it's just so slow. If you're gonna expect us to pay a little bit more because of marketing conditions or whatever, then make your service slightly better. Perhaps we've heard a lot of complaining about the offerings for PS Plus. Those are free games. Sony does not have to do that. But if they're going to charge us more for that, at least give us some concession. It's like, okay, we're going to try to get more first-party games, or we're going to try to make PSN slightly faster. We've heard you. We're gonna give you the option to change your PSN ID. Like these are all engineering back-end things that aren't like super sexy. They're not super exciting. They're not going to entice anybody, but they're going to make your existing customer base much happier. And right now, they said in their press release for this that the reason that they're giving this price increase is because of market conditions. One of the market conditions could be that right now they're doing way better than Microsoft, and the market condition is, well, we can get away with it, so we can. It's not necessarily like, well, the servers are more expensive or whatnot. That may also be the case, but we don't really know. That's really vague language, and I would just expect from Sony, something, anything. If everybody gets a free month of PS Now, any of $10 credit on PSN, something to offset this, like, unfortunately bad news.
Yeah, I would agree. It would have done a lot more for their PR, for sure. Last but not least, we have one last thing. Sony is actually adding two-factor authentication for security reasons. So, as you know, that PlayStation servers are constantly being hit by DDoS attacks, and security has always been kind of weird. A couple of years ago, there was a whole snafu with PS3 and PSN accounts getting completely hacked. Everyone's credit card information, passwords being compromised, and there was a whole class action lawsuit about that. It turns out that Sony has just had a long legacy of not doing much to protect a lot of consumer information, their customers' private information like credit card numbers, and this is a good step, I think, so far. If you want to turn one positive thing about this PS Plus price hike, it's this so far, because this is something that I think a lot of companies should add, period. I think one of the first companies to sort of do this was Google, of course, and then LinkedIn, some major players, and I think a lot more companies need to keep at it. Microsoft as well, improving their Xbox One and Xbox Live security with two-factor authentication, and now Sony has joined in as well. So that's a positive thing. Although, Ryan, I know you read up on it. How are they handling the two-factor authentication?
So right now you can actually sign up for the two-factor authentication on their website. And there's a forum for you to do that. If you don't have access to a computer, you can also do it through the PlayStation app. If you happen to have an Android or an iPhone, you can do it that way. But from what I understand, the two-factor authentication isn't very good, which, considering Sony's past history with hacks, is very surprising. Right now, basically, there isn't a way for them to remember your device. So every time you log into your device, you're going to have to go through both layers of the two-factor authentication, which is super annoying. Most services that offer two-factor auth do offer that option. And on top of it, for your second layer of password, you can only do letters, not just numbers, which obviously limits the kinds of passwords and stuff that you can have, which is also, again, very surprising from Sony considering their history. It's been a long time coming. I'm glad they finally have it, but if you're gonna go behind the security measure full force, particularly if you're Sony, do it. Don't just go halfway there.
Good points there. Let's move on to our new video game releases for this week. First off, the biggest one, which came out earlier this week, Deus Ex Mankind Divided, out now on PC, PS4, and Xbox One. This is an action RPG, first-person shooter, stealth game. I know you're a huge fan of the series, Ryan, so I'll give you the opportunity to talk about it. What have you read so far about the reviews and the reception about this one compared to the last one in the series, which was, I'm blanking on the name right now.
Human Revolution.
Human Revolution, that's right. So what have you heard so far about Mankind Divided?
Well, so you're again playing as Adam Jensen, the protagonist of the other Deus Ex game. I never asked for this. But basically, this game takes place in Prague, mostly. You're trying to, the setting is basically, since the ending of the first game, there was a choice offered at the end, but the way they've kind of made that out in the story canon basically is that led to this thing called the Incident, where basically people with the augmented enhancements to themselves went berserk and went on a murdering spree. And since then, there's been kind of this like racial tension between people who are more natural, who are just regular humans, and people who have had cyber enhancements like Adam Jensen. And Jensen's actually become kind of like an Interpol agent, and he's trying to uncover in this game what's really behind, who's really behind the incident, who's the villain. Again, going over the major like Deus Ex conspiracy theory themes and present in that franchise. And from what I've read, the game seems to be pretty decent for a Deus Ex game, despite the fact that it has kind of like heavy-handed political tone. They used, we wrote a story about it on our site. They used words like mechanical apartheid. There was some concept art that said "All Lives Matter." That stuff, Deus Ex has the potential to tell a really interesting story about racism if they're really going after that angle. But if you're using that kind of coded language, you're saying something political. You're going after something very specific. You have to be very careful when you do stuff like that. And the way it reads just from the marketing kind of just looks like somebody like did a Cliff's Notes version of like a social studies class, and that's what you get.
Referencing the real world movements of Black Lives Matter and, of course, the historical context of South Africa's horrible, horrible history with apartheid. And I have to say, not to toot our own horn, but this is our podcast, so I'm going to. Ryan, you did write a very great commentary on the whole Square Enix sort of snafu on that concept art, because they didn't back down. It didn't seem like they apologized for a lot of this stuff.
Right, but other than that, from what I've heard, that the game seems very like mechanically sound. It seems to be doing a much better job of actually balancing the different options. In the last game, they had these kind of boss battles that if you were playing a stealth character, which the game encouraged you, you got more experience in Human Revolution if you played stealthily, if you didn't try to go for the lethal option. It totally handicapped you for the boss battles where you actually had to kill people. Now it seems in Mankind Divided that they made stealth option more viable. Any way you're interested in playing, if you want to attack a situation by crawling through the vents or going through these gas-filled rooms, you have the options to do that. You can talk your way out of a lot of situations. You could take down bosses non-lethally. It seems like they heard the feedback and actively acted on that. So I'm excited to check it out. Maybe I'll pick it up on a sale. I'm super interested in Deus Ex. I really like the world that they built. I really like the cyber aesthetic that they had in the last game. The two colors that I remember distinctly from Human Revolution were black and gold. I remember that game kind of having this like Tron style feel, and I expect that Mankind Divided probably looks super nice on the PC.
And speaking of Deus Ex, moving on to our next video game release this week, that hit Deus Ex Go. If you remember, there have been Lara Croft Go, there's been a Hitman Go, all being published by Square Enix. They're really interesting puzzle games, very simple. It's available on iOS and Android. I believe it's $3 right now. Don't quote me on that, but I'll put a link to it in the show notes. Anyway, this is a simple stealth game where you're moving around levels and solving puzzles to avoid and stealthily get past guards, other robots, to reach an end goal. And a lot of the times, it involves you actively camouflaging, distracting your opponents, and moving each turn to a separate space. Simple puzzle mechanics, but it makes for a really neat mobile game. And from what I understand, it allows additional unlocks if you actually play Deus Ex Mankind Divided. So I believe it syncs to your Square Enix account. I believe that's how they pull that data down. But very cool. Check that out if you're a fan of Lara Croft Go or Hitman Go before. Very similar to those earlier titles. Also, we have this week Metroid Prime Federation Force on 3DS. This was announced by Nintendo at E3. To a lot of Metroid fans, huge disappointment because it seemed to be a new Metroid Prime Hunters game on handheld, which if you played that originally on the DS, was sort of awkward with its touch controls. You're moving around with the one joystick and then using your stylus on screen to look around. Sort of awkward controls. However, Metroid Prime Federations has sort of been getting mixed reviews so far as a co-op shooter. There is a story campaign. You can play it single player. You can play local multiplayer. You can also play online multiplayer. But it seems to be sort of an awkward new take on Metroid Prime Hunters so far.
Yeah, from what I've heard about it, it seems kind of like a Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker situation where the game is kind of balanced for multiplayer, but if you're a single player, it's going to be a little more difficult. They have this like loadout system where you can come in with different kinds of weapons and tools. You can't have all of them all at the same time, but if you're playing single player, there's actually a loadout item that you can equip that basically makes you twice as powerful and the enemies half as powerful, which seems to be their admission that if you're a single player, they're going to try to make this a little bit easier for you. It seems like the kind of thing where if you had some friends who are interested in playing, might be super cool. It sounds like there's some actually pretty cool level and boss designs, but Metroid Prime Hunters was kind of one of those like early DS examples, like a proof of concept to try to show people how dual screen gaming really would first work. And then it really didn't, it turned into a full game, but it really didn't become much of a thing. People weren't really excited to play that. And also, Nintendo put the Metroid Prime label on it. There hasn't been a true Metroid game in quite some time since the critical failure of Metroid Other M on the Wii. And, Metroid is supposedly one of Nintendo's like flagship franchises, right? It's like, Samus is a character in Super Smash Brothers. Like, Metroid fans are kind of just like left in the lurch. And for Nintendo to just slap the Metroid name on a game that's a co-op shooter that they're trying to go after like the Monster Hunter crowd, like that just seems really odd.
I think what Metroid fans are really looking for is a return to form, something like Super Metroid, right? Metroid Fusion, even the original Metroid on NES, something like that. We use Metroid quite a bit when we describe a lot of games, when we say Metroidvania, that genre style of action-adventure game, side-scrolling, you're tracing back to the same areas. If you've played more recent games like Guacamelee, Axiom Verge, things like that, you're very familiar with that style of play. And the hallmark games in both the Castlevania and Metroid series has been Super Metroid and Castlevania Symphony of the Night. And I think a lot of Metroid fans really want something like that, brand new. And they don't want another first-person shooter, another Metroid Prime game. And by the way, the rain has just started, so we're driving here, still on our way to St. Louis. I want to apologize if you can hear that in the background, so just bear with us. We're also turning on the defoggers in here, so there might be a little bit of whooshing background noise on the final audio. So, also, last video game release I have for this week, I have Oklos, spelled Okhlos, which has been heavily featured on the Steam front page, available on PC. This is a very, very interesting game. This, if I can describe it, it's pixel graphics. Basically, it's a boss rush game where you control hordes and hordes of Greek citizens, and you have to battle all the Greek gods, mythological creatures. In order to do that, the gameplay sort of mirrors Pikmin style, where you're giving commands to your crowd and try to avoid the boss's attacks overall. Ryan, you've put it on your wish list so far. It looks like a really, really cool indie game.
Right, it's being put out by Devolver Digital, and the developer is a first-time game studio. Looks really interesting. There was a mode in, if you remember the game Half Minute Hero and its sequel, there was a mode in that where basically it had this style of gameplay, and I thought that was super fun. A little bit hard to control, particularly if you're going after bosses. If you've played Pikmin, you know that sometimes when you send the Pikmin off to do stuff, much like Lemmings or these kinds of games where you're controlling a big crowd of creatures or whatever, sometimes it's a little bit hard with the AI to get them to do what you want them to do. But I think it's kind of a neat idea. It has a really neat art style, a really cool concept for a game. I like games that have this Greek and Roman setting, and good on Devolver for helping this game getting published. I'm super excited to check it out.
Devolver is on a roll publishing a lot of titles, and that lets us transition to our next segment, what we're playing. And I've been playing Reigns on mobile. I have it on Android. It's also available on iOS, and it's also available on PC as well. I love it so far. Basically, what it is it's a sort of choose-your-own-adventure, but also a survival resource management game. But the way you play the game is the interface looks like the Tinder app, right? The dating app, where you have to swipe left or swipe right. In this case, you're making decisions. You're acting as a king, ruling over a kingdom. And each card that you see appear on screen represents a different character in your court. So, for example, a priest, the court jester, the executioner, like the head of your army, a general of your army, things like that. And you have to make these really wacky, silly choices to manage your kingdom. What you have to do is sort of manage and balance out like your finances, your population, also your religion level, and also your army strength. And if you let one of those meters go too high or too low, you end up dying. For example, if you run out of money, all of a sudden the merchants and noblemen create an oligarchy and send you into exile and you die. It's really, really fascinating concept, really hilarious writing style, and it's this choose-your-own-adventure mechanic. I just really, really think it's really, really funny game. And the way it keeps you hooked is you have to meet certain objectives, so occasionally you'll run into characters that give you sort of this off-the-wall option, this choice decision that leads you on a completely different path. And the game repeats over and over again. You're playing as different kings throughout history. And the goal is to live as long as possible. So each decision you make takes a year. And it's very, very fun. I highly recommend you check it out. It's $3 only. Very, very intriguing.
So I just had a quick question about that. What you're describing kind of sounds like a simplified version of what would happen if Civilization and the Walking Dead Telltale game like had a baby. Is that basically apt?
Civilization in the sense like some of the decisions you're given are like, there are some enemy troops that have appeared from the east. Should we send reinforcements? And you can choose yes or no. And saying yes might deplete your military strength, but it also might increase your population because you're protecting your population. Saying no has other effects, right? But there's all these wacky, hilarious decisions as well. Like, for instance, you'll enter a dungeon. You're asked to turn left or right or enter certain doors. And one door might lead you into a trap and an instant death. The next door might lead you into a talking dragon, for example. I can't recommend it enough. For right now, it's my favorite mobile game that anyone's put out this year so far. What about you, Ryan? What have you been playing recently? I know you mentioned Monster Hunter Generations on your Japan trip. What else have you been playing?
So before I went to Japan, I actually started playing Doom. And then when I came back, that was the first thing I had to race back to and finish. So I did complete Doom. Wow, Taylor, Doom is probably one of my favorite games so far that I've played this year. It's really stellar. It's really kind of amazing that Bethesda brought back something that like one of the most storied franchises in video gaming history. Basically, the game that started first-person shooters, and like did it great justice in like a remake. Like I thought the Wolfenstein remake was pretty good, but it for some people it kind of rubbed them a little bit the wrong way, or it was a little too modern. It was kind of a super interesting idea on a remake of an old franchise. And I think with Doom, they've actually like done new mechanics, but also have made like its own thing. And what's funny is it seems like the game designers kind of asked themselves like, well, how could we make this more metal? You could take any screenshot from that game, and it could be the cover of like a Black Sabbath album. It's super neat. It's an aesthetic that I'm not usually interested in. And it's, you know, it tells Doom also has like a really interesting story, and like I'm not used to like being invested in the story of a Doom game. Like usually I'm there to like blow off steam and like get rid of all the monsters in the monster closet. But this Doom like is super exciting. It plays like old Doom, but it feels like a new game entirely. There aren't true monster closets. There are like great combat arenas. It's fast paced. There are boss battles in this. It's really, really good. Expect that game to be talked about a lot when Game of the Year comes around.
Yeah, I've been playing it myself on PS4, and I have to agree with you. I didn't think Doom could be any gorier than their past games, but they certainly have, and I absolutely love it. There's blood everywhere. I mean, the demonic symbolism. The enemy design is fantastic. The level of design is also super interesting. I love the sort of throwback to all the secret items and hidden rooms you can find, which adds a new layer of exploration during the single-player campaign. I haven't touched the multiplayer at all, but I love the campaign so far. I really love and enjoy playing Doom on PS4. So fun. I love what they did. Very anxious to play through the rest of it. Glad you feel the same way, because I love it so far as well. Also, I should mention, I forgot to mention this before, I have been playing Overwatch a lot, only because of the Summer Games event that Blizzard has been hosting. Which added a weekly brawl called Lucio Ball, which I don't think we've talked about before on the show. But basically, it was a a new mode. The event's now over, so you can't play it right now. Although a lot of fans have been asking for Blizzard to bring it back. Lucio Ball was sort of like Overwatch Rocket League, where everyone played as Lucio, the character. It was a 3-on-3. You're playing in a small soccer arena. Because it was the Summer Games, they couldn't call it the Olympics, but it took place in a Rio de Janeiro stadium. The object is to score in the opponent's goal, and you use Lucio's abilities to shoot the ball around the arena. It was very fun. You could still earn XP, but also there were some cosmetic new skins, emotes, sprays, also flags for your player icon as well that were all Olympic themed. So really, really cool. Although there was a lot of uproar about the fact that these summer loot boxes, you could only unlock these things for a limited time, and they were not going to be sold at a later date. Blizzard has gone out and said, well, we wanted to create items that could only be unlocked for a limited time only, right, to reward the players who continued to play Overwatch regularly. And they're not going to make these items available now that the event is over, which is kind of a shame because they have the coolest skins out there. I unlocked Lucio, a skin where it looks like he's a soccer player. He's carrying a ball of soccer bags. Behind him, he's wearing shin guards. He's wearing a headband. A very, very cool reskin of him. There have been a lot of really interesting, neat ones out there. And I wish Blizzard would just make a shop where you could buy these limited event cosmetic unlocks they have.
Well, Blizzard has a history of really doing that. They've done that in WoW. They regularly put out in-game cosmetic items that you can only get if you attended BlizzCon. And then, of course, people sell those items for $1 bajillion on eBay, and Blizzard's done this with Diablo 3 too. They do this with all their games, and I just think with Overwatch it's a little bit of a different story because it caught such a popular fever with people, and the game doesn't really have a strict progression mechanic that you get a level and you get another loot box, another box of random in-game items. I think people were a little bent out of shape because on top of the randomness of the regular loot boxes, you also have a limited time event. So for example, I was in Japan the 2 weeks that event was running, and I only had basically played 3 games of Overwatch and got one loot box, and the time has run out, the event is over. Unless they reissued those items or put them in the loot boxes again, I'm never going to get another chance. And I think a lot of people felt very similarly.
Yeah, I think the whole event lasted about 3 to 4 weeks total, maybe 3 weeks, the whole duration of the Olympics. Yeah, it's kind of a shame. I agree. It's kind of weird. All right, moving on to our next segment. We've got new video game announcements for this week, which is very short because the notable one is Metal Gear Survive. Really an announcement out of nowhere out of Konami because with the whole Hideo Kojima leaving the studio and Konami kicked him out. And we thought, that's it. That's the end of the Metal Gear franchise. All of a sudden, we have this new game. What is Metal Gear Survive, Ryan?
Oh, boy, Taylor. So I'm going to bring you back to Japan just briefly. So this news came out kind of on my second to last day there. Trailer did not excite a lot of people. I did not hear a lot of people talking about Metal Gear Survive in Japan.
Because you didn't speak Japanese.
Well, there's that. But also, we kind of expected, when Konami kind of more or less kicked Hideo Kojima out of their company, we expected them to basically get out of the video game business. And then they did the thing that we expected all Japanese video game companies who are trying to exit the video game industry to do. They put out a trailer for a Metal Gear Pachinko game. And now they're saying wait, we're so interested in video games, we're going to make this for multiplayer co-op survival game based around Metal Gear. It's not going to be made by Hideo Kojima. It's basically going to look like Metal Gear Solid 5.
Using the Fox engine?
Using the Fox engine. And
any returning characters?
So what's interesting is that the story justification for this game is if you played through Ground Zeroes, basically at the end of that very short game, Big Boss's military base that he's trying to build basically gets torn to pieces because there's a discovery that they're building a nuclear weapons platform. And what happens in Metal Gear Survive is that that does take place, but a wormhole appears in the time-space continuum, and all the surviving soldiers that would normally be dead in Metal Gear Solid 5, the main canon, get sucked through this time hole and into an alternate universe where there are zombies that they have to fight and try to survive and make do. And the whole thing reads like it's an asset flip. Like
they jumped the shark.
Like Konami spent all this money on Metal Gear Solid 5. It was a critical and commercial success, but it was also very expensive. It had a very long, storied, protracted development, and they didn't quite make the money that they wanted to just based on Metal Gear Solid 5. So they need to make another game using the same art, just with a little bit of different take. And I just think, like, I don't know. I think I'm on board because I'm such a big Metal Gear fan. I've played all the Metal Gear games. Some of actually the Metal Gear spin-off games have been quite good without the presence of Hideo Kojima. I'm thinking of Metal Gear Rising. That game was really good.
I would say Metal Gear Acid and Acid 2, but I know a lot of people didn't like them, but they were really, really interesting card games on the PSP.
Right, they were like fun takes on the Metal Gear franchise. They also had some like story tie-ins. Konami at the time like was really interested in having still kind of the same like political themes and the conspiracy and all the like characters that you know and love. And all this reads is like as a cash grab. This reads like them trying to make a game that's like Left 4 Dead but Metal Gear. And as much as I enjoyed Metal Gear Solid 5, it was our game of the year last year. I really enjoyed not only the story but also the gameplay. I think that gameplay works very well in this kind of game. But what I'm kind of conflicted about is that one of the things about Metal Gear is it's a stealth action game, right? Like the much more the stealth than the action. When things kind of go to pot in Metal Gear games, like your first instinct isn't to fight the world. Your instinct is to go hide in a box. And it's all based on like you look at a level, and you try to like memorize guard patterns, and you try to like sneak around that way. And this reads like, what if Metal Gear, but the AI was bad, so we made the AI guards zombies? And what if instead of like Big Boss or Solid Snake or Ocelot or any of those characters that you might have enjoyed, what if it was just the like random soldiers that you played as? Like, I don't know. It's a really weird direction for Metal Gear.
The ones you rescued from Metal Gear Portable Ops. That's what all the recruitment was for.
Right. And like, as much as I liked the base building, and I thought the multiplayer mode in Metal Gear Solid 5 was actually like halfway decent, I'm not sure that I'd want a full game on it. It was like a nice add-on, but it wasn't something I'd want a full game on. So this just seems like a really weird direction. I'm very skeptical that this is going to play out well for them. It just reads like a cash grab.
You and a lot of people who have reacted to this news too, everyone's clamoring for more Metal Gear content from Konami, and they didn't want this. They wanted some story-rich single-player new game, and instead they got a co-op shooter, multiplayer shooter. I mean, come on. Yeah, it's very, very, very weird, so we'll stay tuned for that. Let's talk about this week in gaming history, because it was a big one. The SNES, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, known as the Super Famicom in Japan, here in North America, the SNES, was released on August 23rd, 1991. So that's 24 years ago. So it's the 25th anniversary. I can't do any math. So 25 years ago it came out. Some people have said that August 23rd isn't really the true release date because record keeping in the 90s was pretty terrible for video game history. But I think the overall consensus on the internet is around the month of August. Okay. Anyway, regardless, let's talk a little bit more about the SNES's impact on the industry because it's a huge one, right? We equate it with the console wars of the 90s between Nintendo and Sega, between the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis. The Genesis does what Nintendo don't, and Sega took this approach in its marketing that it was more hip, it was cool, Nintendo was more family-friendly, it had better graphics, 32-bit as opposed to the SNES's 16-bit. But, of course, who won? Everyone would arguably say Nintendo, and the rest is history. But with the Super Nintendo, some major landmark titles, Super Mario Kart, Super Mario World, Super Mario RPG, right? These are all first party so far. Legend of Zelda, Link to the Past, Super Metroid. I mean, the list goes on. A lot of amazing, greatest of all time games came out. Chrono Trigger as well. Some very awesome, arguably the best Final Fantasies came out on Super Nintendo as well. Just a huge, amazing legacy that it left behind. And for me personally, it's the game that we grew up, or it's the console that we grew up on, and my all-time favorite.
Yeah, it's funny. I think the Super Nintendo is something that a lot of people think fondly of. It was the console that basically you went to other people's houses, and like if you saw it was a Nintendo household, they had the SNES, and it was just like, Like this console was really fun. It had a lot of great games, a vast library that had lots of different genres of games in. Like you said, it was the console that we grew up with. The controller, super comfortable, way more comfortable than the Genesis. It had 4 buttons, which from the NES was double the buttons. Also had shoulder buttons that eventually got us used to the L and R.
It influenced a lot of future controllers. I think everyone is trying to find a comfortable yet also easy to use controller the way the SNES introduced it to the world. The iconic D-pad and 4 face buttons was very good design, and the dog bone shape was very comfortable in your hands. You could play for a while without your hands hurting, whereas for something before like the NES was rectangular, small, your hands sort of cramped after a while, even in kids' hands. And also with the Atari 2600 and even before then, the joystick and singular button were sort of awkward. The Pong paddles, things like that. The controllers hadn't really been perfected. I think Nintendo made a huge leap with the Super Nintendo.
Yeah, I also think the Super Nintendo, like we said, had a lot of games that had spanned the genres. But it usually, between the Super Nintendo versions and the Genesis versions of games were kind of known for better sound. But if you actually wanted something that was closer to arcade ports of the real games that were home consoleized better, the better version was almost always the Super Nintendo version. We're talking about games like Aladdin. The Super Nintendo version, a lot of people recognize that as the better version of that game. Street Fighter 2, better version of that was on the Super Nintendo. NBA Jam, despite the fact that the sound might have been better on the Genesis, the version of NBA Jam was sold way better on the Super Nintendo because that was a console that everybody had. On top of it, the Super Nintendo saw the beginnings of a lot of storied franchises, right? Star Fox, super memorable game from that console. You can argue about Star Fox's influence on the industry. After the original Star Fox, a lot of people probably say the original Star Fox is probably the best one. But Nintendo was very looking to the future with the SNES, the Super FX chip, a big deal. That Mode 7, again, a huge deal. Games like F-Zero, a lot of
Stunt Racer FX, another good example.
Yeah, Stunt Racer FX. Basically, what Japanese RPGs made their debut on the Nintendo console. Games like Final Fantasy III, games like Chrono Trigger, games that you typically didn't. These long, crazy, great story, great characters, very memorable. I still have some of these RPG soundtracks memorized, and they're all from the the MIDI sounds that were playing on the SNES. I spent a lot of time with that console, and it's just I think it was a big critical favorite. One of Nintendo's most successful consoles, for sure.
Critical darling, but unfortunately not a huge commercial success in Nintendo's history, because compared to the NES, it actually didn't sell as well, believe it or not. The original Nintendo Entertainment System sold about 60 million units. These are all rough estimates because sales numbers weren't widely available, weren't well published back during the 90s, but estimated about 60 million unit sales with the NES, but then the Super Nintendo, it's estimated that it only sold about 33 million unit sales. But compared to Nintendo's future success, I think it paved the way for them to experiment a little bit with the N64, which also was not a very commercial success. It sold less than the Super Nintendo, and the GameCube also pretty bad. But the Wii sold gangbusters, over 100 million unit sales. Extremely popular. Nintendo is still relevant to this day, even though the Wii U is sort of a disappointment. But the Super Nintendo is really what started them on the path to home console success.
Yeah, and it's funny because Nintendo has always been a company about backwards compatibility. Super Nintendo did not have, their NES games were not playable on the SNES. But almost always when we talk about games from Nintendo's back catalog, when they put out Virtual Console stuff, almost always the first games to come out on those kinds of platforms for Nintendo are SNES games,
right? Which
really speaks to how powerful, how influential the games on that console really shook out to be.
A good example of that, for example, Earthbound. The Super Nintendo, I think, is what the emulation community was really focusing and honing in on, because historically, before Virtual Console was introduced on the Wii, it was very difficult to find these games. Cartridges, they either, some titles were not made in huge quantities, And if they weren't, they were very difficult to purchase online because they were very expensive. And so as a result, it really drove a lot of the demand online to play these games sort of illegally. And unfortunately, Nintendo has lost a lot of their third-party licenses. Those agreements have since lapsed, and therefore they cannot put out those games on Virtual Console. I'll give you an example of this. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 4, Turtles in Time. One of the best beat-em-ups ever out there, right? It was originally on arcades, and the Super Nintendo port was excellent, superb. We played that game many times. Battletoads and Double Dragon, another good example, right? Very, very fun, cooperative two-player game. A lot of great variety, like you said, genres, but a lot of great two-player games as well. What are some of the other memorable titles that you remember from the SNES library, Ryan?
I spent a lot of time with Mario Kart, Super Mario World. A lot of people go back and forth on whether that or Super Mario Bros. 3 on the NES is the best Mario platformer game ever. There's certainly a strong case to be made for Mario World. I got all the endings for Chrono Trigger back in the day. I spent a lot of time with games like Tetris Attack on that platform, puzzle games. There was Mario Paint, which was kind of a weird, fun experiment for Nintendo. And also, as far as experiments, let's also talk about what they did for another company, Sony. Originally, the SNES's popularity led Sony, which was really just a TV company at that point, to get interested in the video game industry. And they were interested in building a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo, and they were going to call this add-on the PlayStation, and it was going to work in sync with the Super Nintendo. And as physical media kind of turned away from cartridges and into CDs, this was going to push Nintendo into the new era. Sony and Nintendo were going to have this wonderful partnership, and it was supposed to work. They were going to sell a new version of the Super Nintendo with the CD add-on. It would play both the traditional SNES cartridge games, but it also play new games that Nintendo and Sony would put out together that were going to be in CD format. Basically, the story on that is that never came to fruition.
The business deal definitely fell through, and we only saw one prototype, and that was only revealed in the past year. So really, really interesting history there, because in 1994, Sony released a rival console, the PlayStation, released games on CD, which was a huge graphical jump, and all of a sudden the Super Nintendo couldn't compete, right? And that's when Sony started to compete in that space. And instead of being a cooperative company, it was their biggest rival all of a sudden. So who knows what the legacy of future games or future home consoles would have been had they actually cooperated and put that out, the Super Nintendo PlayStation. So really interesting, cool history. Anything else you want to add about your memories of the SNES on its 25th anniversary this year?
I just want to say that it's like one of those consoles that I really kept in my library for a long time. It's one of my favorite consoles. I love the way it looked. It had this kind of gray aesthetic here in the States with these purple buttons. Very unusual. The buttons on the controller itself were purple and light purple. It's an aesthetic that I think has paved the way. Like I look forward to getting controllers and consoles that look as beautiful as the SNES once did. And I don't think Nintendo has, I continue to buy Nintendo consoles, but I don't think there's ever been just such a beautiful and functional console as the Super Nintendo. Just one of my favorite consoles of all time.
And you also own that Hyperkin Superboy, which is a portable version of the SNES, but actually uses the real cartridges. But you also own a Retron 5 as well, right?
Right, and I enjoy using the Super Nintendo controller on those consoles that are trying to emulate basically the Super Nintendo experience. As you may or may not know, the Super Nintendo at the time was manufactured with this material that basically, when it was exposed to oxygen, made the console kind of turn this yellowish color, and a lot of the original Super Nintendo hardware either does not work anymore, or it's this really disgusting yellow. It kind of looks like a toxic tainted color.
Well, that's because it was made with a fire protective coating. So eventually that wears off over time, and instead of that sort of gray matte look, you see a yellowing of that plastic. Nowadays, if you're seeing a true original Super Nintendo, if someone owns it, it looks kind of gross, right? Very yellowish, old, but still, you're right. I agree. I love the aesthetic. It's the console we grew up on, so just want to give a huge nod to Nintendo that we still really appreciate its library. Loved what it did. Best games of all time. A lot of them have been released or were released on the Super Nintendo. So let's wrap it up. We're not doing a bonus stage this week because it would be way too awkward reading off our stories while we're driving. So just wanted to say thanks again for listening. I know it's a long episode this week. If you liked our show, please rate, review, subscribe to us on iTunes and Stitcher, but we're basically available everywhere else. You look us up on Clamor, search for us on your favorite podcast app. You can hear us anywhere you like. But please rate and review us on iTunes and Stitcher. It would be a huge, huge help for us. Let us know what you think about our show.
We're also going to be including notes for this week's show on our show notes. Look at that on our site, which is 1pvs2p.com. You can also follow us on Twitter. That's at 1pvs2p_podcast. Follow us on Facebook.
We're also on YouTube and Twitch. And as always, we want to thank Phonetic Hero for the use of his songs for our show. Coffee Stomp and Super Manly Brothers X. Both of those songs are part of the compilation project Chip Tunes Equals Win.
Thanks, everybody. We will see you next week.
Super Mario World is here. It's one of the new generation of Nintendo games. It comes only with Super Nintendo, and it's like nothing you've ever faced. Now you're playing with power. Superpower.